2 weeks after the battle, the human fleet prepared to return to Earth. The Defiance and its sister ships had been repaired, their damage patched with a combination of human and Valari materials. The crews were exhausted but triumphant. They had fought an alien enemy and won. Now they wanted to go home and see their families. Lieutenant Sophie Grant sat at her station running final system checks before departure. Everything was operating within normal parameters, but something bothered her. She had been reviewing the combat data from the battle, analyzing every sensor reading and every tactical decision. The more she studied the information, the more concerned she became. She pulled up the recorded data on swarm ship movements and numbers. During the battle, her targeting systems had tracked and cataloged every enemy vessel. The computer had estimated the total swarm force at approximately 300 bioships of various sizes. That was a significant force, one that had nearly overwhelmed the Valari defenses. But Sophie noticed something odd. The largest swarm vessels, the hive ships that coordinated the smaller organisms, had retreated early in the battle. They had not fought to the death like the smaller bioships. Instead, they had pulled back as soon as the tide turned against them. That suggested intelligence and strategic thinking, not mindless aggression. Sophie dug deeper into the data. She cross-referenced the sensor logs with the Valari historical records of swarm attacks. The Valari had provided detailed accounts of the previous battles, including estimates of enemy numbers and tactics. When Sophie compared those records to what humanity had faced, she found something disturbing. The swarm force that attacked Valor Prime was small compared to the fleets that had destroyed the other Valari worlds. Those previous attacks had involved thousands of bioships, not hundreds. The assault on the homeworld should have been even larger, a final overwhelming strike to finish the Valari forever. But it was not. Sophie felt cold realization wash over her. The swarm force they had fought was not an invasion fleet. It was a scouting party, a test to see what the Valari could do, what defenses they had left. The main swarm force was somewhere else, doing something else. She immediately took her findings to Admiral Patricia Cole. Patricia was in her ready room, reviewing departure schedules and writing reports for Earth Command. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. But when Sophie explained what she had discovered, Patricia's exhaustion vanished, replaced by sharp focus. They called an emergency meeting with the senior staff and Commander Thelvar. Within an hour, everyone gathered in the Defiance's briefing room. Sophie presented her analysis, showing the comparison data and explaining her conclusions. The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. Commander Jake Morrison spoke first. He said if the swarm only sent a scouting force, that meant the main fleet was still out there. And if they had been testing the Valari defenses, they now knew that the Valari had new allies with powerful weapons. The swarm would adapt their tactics accordingly. Thelvar confirmed that the swarm always adapted. That was what made them so dangerous. They learned from every battle, every defeat, every victory. The hive mind processed information and created new strategies, new warrior organisms, new approaches to conquest. The fact that they had retreated at all was unusual. Normally, the swarm fought until every organism was dead. Chief Engineer Danny Price added another disturbing thought. The swarm hive ships had seen human weapons in action. They had experienced the railguns, the missiles, and the plasma lance. They now knew what humanity was capable of. That information would spread through the hive mind to every swarm fleet in the galaxy. Humanity had announced its presence to the enemy in the most aggressive way possible. Admiral Patricia Cole stood at the head of the table, her face carved from stone. She said they needed to find out more about the swarm, where they came from, how large their forces were, and what their ultimate goals might be. The Valari had been fighting defensively, reacting to attacks rather than gathering intelligence about the enemy. That needed to change. Over the next 3 days, human and Valari intelligence teams worked together to compile everything known about the swarm. The picture that emerged was terrifying. The swarm had first appeared in this region of space over 200 years ago. They had consumed dozens of species, entire civilizations wiped from existence. The Valari were just the latest victims. The swarm operated from a central location, though no one knew exactly where. They sent out fleets in all directions, attacking any world with significant biological populations. They did not negotiate, did not communicate except through violence. They simply came, consumed, and moved on. Planets they conquered were left as dead rocks, stripped of all organic matter. Some species had tried to fight. None had succeeded for long. The swarm always outnumbered their enemies, and they adapted faster than most civilizations could respond. A few scattered refugee populations remained, hiding in remote systems or fleeing ahead of the advancing swarm tide. Lieutenant Sophie Grant made another discovery while reviewing deep space sensor data. In the outer reaches of the Velari system, beyond the orbit of the furthest planet, her sensors had detected strange readings during the battle. At first, she thought they were sensor ghosts or background radiation. But on closer examination, she realized they were real. Something had been watching the battle. Multiple somethings, in fact. Large objects, possibly ships, had maintained position in the outer system throughout the entire engagement. They had not moved, had not attacked, had just observed. Then, after the battle ended, they had disappeared. Sophie had no idea what they were, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. She showed the data to Patricia, who immediately understood the implications. The swarm had not just sent a scouting force to attack the Velari. They had also sent observers to watch and record everything. Those observers had now returned to the swarm hive mind with complete information about human capabilities, tactics, and technology. Patricia made a decision. She would send 2 dreadnoughts back to Earth with the majority of the crews and Marines. They would carry the news of the victory and begin preparing humanity for a larger war. But she would keep the Defiance and 2 other ships in Velari space. They would work with the Velari to gather intelligence on the swarm and prepare defenses for the inevitable counterattack. The crews were not happy about the split. Families would have to wait longer for reunions. But everyone understood the necessity. The swarm knew about humanity now, and they would be planning their response. Better to be prepared than to be caught by surprise. Back on Earth, Admiral Patricia Cole's reports caused panic and frantic activity in equal measure. The Defense Council met in emergency session for 3 days straight. The revelation that humanity had attracted the attention of a galaxy-spanning threat made some members question whether they should have responded to the Velari distress call at all, but the majority saw it differently. The swarm would have reached human space eventually. Better to face them with allies and knowledge than alone and ignorant. The Velari Alliance provided both. Earth's industrial capacity went into overdrive, building new dreadnoughts and training new crews. The timeline for the new ships was accelerated from years to months. Meanwhile, in the deepest reaches of space, far beyond any world humanity or the Velari had ever seen, something stirred in the darkness. The Swarm Queen, an entity of vast intelligence and terrible hunger, received the memories of her scouts. She processed the images of human ships, human weapons, and human tactics. For centuries, the swarm had conquered without significant resistance. Species fell before them like grain before a scythe. Some fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing against overwhelming numbers and biological superiority. The swarm had grown complacent, assured of inevitable victory. Now that certainty was shaken. These humans had destroyed a swarm force with frightening efficiency. Their weapons were crude but devastating. Their tactics were aggressive and coordinated. Most disturbing, they had traveled across the stars to help a species they had never met. That spoke of resources, organization, and a willingness to fight that the swarm had rarely encountered. The Queen began making adjustments. She redirected resources from expansion to consolidation. She ordered the creation of new warrior organisms specifically designed to counter kinetic weapons, heavier armor, faster movement, redundant organs to survive massive trauma. The biology of the swarm was infinitely adaptable, and the Queen had centuries of genetic data to draw upon. She also made a strategic decision. The humans had shown themselves to be dangerous, but the Queen did not yet know how widespread their civilization was. More scouting was needed. She dispatched small, stealthy bioships to search for human worlds. Once she knew where humanity's home was, she could plan accordingly. Back on Valor Prime, Commander Jake Morrison trained Velari soldiers in human combat doctrine. He taught them about squad tactics, covering fire, and the importance of overwhelming force at decisive moments. The Velari learned quickly, their natural intelligence and discipline making them excellent students. Sergeant Lisa Chen worked with Velari engineers to fortify the capital city. They built bunkers, established supply caches, and created evacuation routes for civilians. 3 days after the battle, the Velari capital began to recover. Human engineering teams worked alongside Volari construction crews to clear debris and restore power to damaged sectors. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded, and human doctors found themselves learning alien biology on the fly. The language barrier remained challenging, but translation software improved with each passing hour as linguists from both species worked together. Admiral Patricia Cole stood in what remained of the Volari High Council chamber. The building had survived the swarm attack, though one wall was now open to the sky where a bioship had crashed through it. The chamber was beautiful despite the damage, with walls of a crystalline material that seemed to generate its own soft light. The Volari had a gift for architecture that made even their ruins stunning. The High Council consisted of 7 Volari, each representing a different region or discipline of their civilization. They were tall beings, averaging about 7 feet in height, with silver skin that shifted between shades depending on the light. Their eyes were large and expressive, capable of showing emotion that humans could recognize despite the alien features. They wore robes of a material that looked like liquid metal, and when they moved, the fabric seemed to flow around them. Commander Thelvar introduced Patricia to the council members. The eldest was Speaker Velnara, who governed the council meetings. She spoke in the musical Volari language, and a translation device rendered her words into human speech with only a slight delay. She thanked Patricia and all of humanity for their intervention. Without human help, the Volari would have been extinct within days. Patricia responded simply. She told them that humanity could not stand by while another species faced annihilation. The Volari had asked for help and humanity had answered. It was what any civilized species should do. Speaker Velnara was quiet for a moment, her large eyes studying Patricia carefully. Then she said something that the translation device struggled with, finally rendering it as understanding that humanity was different. The Volari had encountered 3 other spacefaring species in their history. One had ignored their attempts at contact. Another had demanded tribute. The third had tried to conquer them. Humanity was the first to offer help without demands or conditions. Patricia felt uncomfortable with the praise. She explained that humanity was far from perfect. They had their own history of conflict and injustice, but they tried to be better, to live up to their ideals even when it was difficult. The Volari distress call had been a test of those ideals, and humanity had chosen to pass it. The council members conferred among themselves in their native language, their voices rising and falling in harmonious patterns. Finally, Speaker Velnara spoke again. She said the Volari wished to forge a formal alliance with humanity. They would share their technology, their knowledge, and their resources. In return, they asked only for continued friendship and the hope that humanity would help defend other worlds if the swarm returned. Patricia accepted on behalf of Earth's government, though she noted that formal ratification would need to wait until she could communicate with her superiors. But she believed Earth would agree. An alliance with the Volari would benefit both species enormously. Over the next week, the true scope of cooperation began to emerge. The Volari had been spacefaring for over 2,000 years, far longer than humanity. Their understanding of certain technologies exceeded human knowledge by centuries. They shared data on advanced hyperspace navigation that would cut human travel times in half. They provided designs for energy shields more efficient than anything human engineers had imagined. They taught human scientists about exotic materials and power sources. In return, humans shared their military doctrine and weapon designs. The Volari were amazed by human weapons technology. They had focused on energy-based systems, elegant and efficient but lacking raw destructive power. Human kinetic weapons were brutish by comparison, but their effectiveness against the swarm could not be denied. Volari engineers began adapting railgun technology for their own ships. Lieutenant Sophie Grant spent her days working with Volari weapon specialists. She showed them how to calculate firing solutions for kinetic weapons and how to coordinate multiple gun batteries. The Volari were quick learners, grasping concepts that had taken human engineers decades to perfect. Sophie found herself learning just as much from them, particularly about energy management and targeting sensors that operated on principles human science had not yet discovered. Chief Engineer Danny Price was in heaven. The Volari power systems were centuries ahead of human technology, and they were willing to share everything. He spent 18-hour days studying their reactor designs and energy distribution networks. The Volari used something they called quantum resonance cores, which generated power by exploiting properties of quantum entanglement. Danny could barely understand the mathematics, but he was determined to learn. One of the Valari engineers, a younger individual named Korvek, became Danny's constant companion. Korvek was fascinated by human engineering philosophy, which he described as aggressive and direct. Where Valari engineers sought elegance and efficiency, humans built systems that were robust and powerful. Korvek believed combining both approaches would create something greater than either alone. The Marines also found common ground with the Valari military. Commander Jake Morrison worked with the Valari Ground Force commander, a warrior named Thalon who had survived 3 battles against the swarm before the humans arrived. Thalon was impressed by human combat tactics, particularly the emphasis on teamwork and covering fire. Valari soldiers traditionally fought as individuals, relying on their personal skill and energy weapons. Human squad tactics were a revelation. Jake trained alongside Valari soldiers, teaching them human small unit tactics. In return, the Valari taught humans about their world and culture. The two groups bonded over shared meals and shared stories. Language remained a barrier, but soldiers had their own universal language of respect and camaraderie. Sergeant Lisa Chen became particularly close with a Valari warrior named Siltara. They had fought together during the clearing of the eastern districts and had saved each other's lives multiple times. Siltara taught Lisa about Valari philosophy and art. Lisa taught Siltara about human history and the various cultures of Earth. They discovered that despite vast biological differences, both species valued loyalty, courage, and protecting the innocent. The cultural exchange went both ways throughout the city. Human Marines explored Valari markets and museums. Valari civilians visited human encampments and marveled at human food, music, and technology. Children from both species played together in the refugee centers, finding that games transcended language barriers. Admiral Patricia Cole watched it all with satisfaction. This was what she had hoped for, not just a military victory, but the beginning of genuine friendship between species. The Valari were good people and they deserved to survive. Humanity had given them that chance. On the 10th day after the battle, Speaker Velnara requested a private meeting with Patricia. They met in a garden that had somehow survived the swarm attack. The Valari plants were strange to human eyes, with leaves that shifted colors and flowers that seemed to sing in the breeze. Patricia walked beside the speaker, both of them enjoying the peaceful moment after so much violence. Speaker Velnara spoke of her people's history, how they had spread across multiple worlds and built a civilization of art and science. They had thought themselves advanced and powerful. Then the swarm came, and in weeks they were reduced to a single world on the edge of extinction. It had been humbling and terrifying. She asked Patricia how humanity had become so strong. How had they built such powerful weapons and such disciplined military forces? What drove humans to fight so fiercely? Patricia thought carefully before answering. She explained that humanity's history was violent. Humans had fought each other for thousands of years, developing weapons and tactics in an endless cycle of conflict. It was not something to be proud of, but it had made them very good at warfare. When humanity finally reached the stars, they brought that knowledge with them. But, Patricia continued, humanity had also learned something else from their bloody history. They had learned that strength meant nothing if it was not used for good. The greatest human warriors were not those who conquered the most territory, but those who protected the innocent and stood against tyranny. That was what the distress call represented, a chance to use human strength for something noble. Speaker Velnara was quiet for a long time. Then she said that the Valari had much to learn from humanity, not just about weapons and tactics, but about what it meant to be truly strong. She hoped that the alliance between their peoples would be long and fruitful, and that together they could face whatever threats the galaxy held. Patricia agreed. She believed that humanity and the Valari could accomplish great things together. They complemented each other perfectly. The Valari brought knowledge, wisdom, and centuries of peaceful development. Humanity brought military strength, industrial might, and a stubborn refusal to quit when things got hard. As the meeting ended, Speaker Velnara gave Patricia a gift. It was a small crystal that seemed to contain a swirling galaxy of light within it. The orbital battle was won, but the war for Valar Prime had only just begun. From space, the planet looked beautiful, a blue and green world wrapped in white clouds. But the tactical scans told a different story. Red markers covered the continents, each one indicating a swarm infestation. The aliens had landed thousands of organisms before the human fleet arrived, and those creatures were now burrowing into cities, forests, and mountains. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the drop bay of the Defiance, surrounded by his Marines. They were suited up in full combat armor, heavy plates of reinforced composite that could stop most small arms fire and resist environmental hazards. Each Marine carried an assault rifle, a sidearm, and enough ammunition to fight for hours. Some also had flamethrowers, grenade launchers, or heavy machine guns. Jake checked his weapon one last time. It was an older model, reliable and tested. He preferred weapons he understood over fancy new technology. His helmet display showed the mission briefing, a map of the Valari capital city with multiple swarm nest sites marked in red. The plan was simple. Drop in, clear the nests, and protect the civilian population while the Valari military regrouped. The dropships were ready. These were tough, ugly vessels designed for one purpose: getting Marines from orbit to ground safely and quickly. They had thick armor, powerful engines, and enough firepower to suppress an enemy landing zone. Jake had made dozens of combat drops in his career. This one would be the most important. Admiral Patricia Cole gave the authorization for ground operations. The dropships launched from all 5 Dreadnoughts simultaneously, 300 small craft carrying over 5,000 Marines toward the planet below. They entered the atmosphere in tight formations, their heat shields glowing orange as friction built up around them. The Valari watched the descent from their remaining military installations. They had never seen anything like it. The human dropships looked aggressive, all angles and armor, nothing like the graceful Valari transports. When the ships fired their retro thrusters and began landing near the capital city, the sound was like continuous thunder rolling across the landscape. Jake's dropship touched down in what had been a public park. Now it was a battlefield. The grass was burned away, replaced by a black organic substance that looked like hardened resin. Strange pod-like structures dotted the area, each one pulsing with a sickly green light, and everywhere there were swarm organisms. The creatures came in multiple varieties. The smallest were about the size of large dogs, fast and aggressive with razor-sharp claws. The medium ones were built like bears, heavily armored with mandibles that could bite through steel. The largest were massive beetle-like monsters that lumbered forward on 6 legs, each one as thick as a tree trunk. The dropship's ramp slammed down, and Jake led his Marines out into hell. The swarm creatures saw them immediately and charged. Jake opened fire, his rifle barking in controlled bursts. The bullets tore through the smaller organisms, dropping them in sprays of ichor. His Marines spread out in a disciplined line, creating overlapping fields of fire. Sergeant Lisa Chen was at his side, her weapon chattering as she targeted the medium-sized creatures. The bullets sparked off their armor at first, but she adjusted her aim, targeting the joints and softer areas between plates. The creatures fell, screeching in alien rage as they died. One of the large beetle monsters charged toward their position. Jake grabbed a rocket launcher from one of his Marines and took aim. The creature was moving fast, faster than something that big should be able to move. Jake led the target carefully and fired. The rocket streaked across the park and slammed into the creature's head. The explosion was massive, and when the smoke cleared, the monster was down, half its body blown apart. But there were more. Always more. The swarm organisms poured out of the pod structures, an endless tide of teeth and claws. The Marines held their ground, firing continuously, but Jake knew they could not sustain this forever. They needed to destroy the nests at the source. He ordered 2 squads to provide covering fire while the rest advanced on the nearest pod structure. The Marines moved in teams, leapfrogging forward, always keeping some guns aimed at the enemy. They reached the pod, which was about the size of a house and made of the same black resinous material that covered the ground. One of the Marines, a young woman named Kelly Brooks, stepped forward with a flamethrower. She had always been fascinated by fire, which made her perfect for this job. She opened the valve and sent a stream of burning fuel across the pod's surface. The organic material caught instantly, burning with a greasy black smoke. The pod began to collapse in on itself, and the organisms inside died screaming. Jake ordered the same treatment for all the pod structures in the area. The Marines spread out, working in teams. Flamethrowers roared. Explosives detonated. The swarm nests burned, and with each one destroyed, the number of attacking creatures decreased. Across the city, similar battles were happening. Human Marines had landed at a dozen sites, each one a swarm infestation. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, exactly the kind of combat that played to human strengths. The Marines used their training, their weapons, and their sheer stubborn refusal to back down. In one district, a squad led by Corporal Tim Walsh found themselves surrounded by swarm organisms in a collapsed building. They formed a defensive circle and fought back to back, burning through ammunition at an alarming rate. Just when things looked desperate, a Valari military unit arrived. The Valari soldiers were tall and slender, with silver skin and large eyes. They carried energy weapons that hummed as they fired. The Valari joined the fight, and together with the humans, they broke through the swarm encirclement. Tim tried to thank them, but the language barrier made communication difficult. Instead, he just nodded and raised his fist. The Valari commander seemed to understand the gesture and returned it. In that moment, a bond formed between the two species, forged in combat against a common enemy. Back at Jake's position, the last of the pod structures was burning. The immediate area was clear, but Jake knew there were more nests throughout the city. He contacted the other squad leaders and compiled reports. Casualties had been lighter than expected, thanks to the heavy armor and superior firepower. But they had lost people, good Marines who would never go home. Jake pushed the grief aside. There would be time to mourn later. Right now he had a job to do. He ordered his forces to advance toward the next target, a large nest that had been established in what the Valari called the Temple District. Intelligence suggested it was one of the primary hives on the planet. The Temple District had been beautiful once, filled with crystalline structures that captured and reflected light in stunning patterns. Now it was a nightmare. The swarm had covered everything in their organic resin. The temples were half dissolved, their materials consumed to feed the growing hive. And at the center of it all was a massive structure that pulsed like a beating heart. Jake approached cautiously, his Marines spread out in a wide formation. The hive structure was enormous, easily 100 meters tall and half as wide. It was heavily defended by the largest swarm organisms Jake had seen yet, creatures that looked like they had been designed specifically for combat. They had thick armor, multiple limbs, and weapon-like biological appendages that could spit acid or launch barbed projectiles. This was going to be a hard fight. Jake called for support, and within minutes 2 dropships arrived overhead. They circled the hive, firing their cannons at the defending organisms. The heavy gunfire tore through the swarm creatures, clearing a path for the ground forces. Jake ordered the advance. The Marines charged forward, firing as they ran. The swarm defenders met them with savage fury. The battle devolved into chaos, with both sides locked in desperate close combat. Jake found himself face to face with one of the large warrior organisms. It swung a blade-like limb at his head, and he barely ducked in time. He brought his rifle up and fired a full magazine into the creature's underside. It collapsed, ichor leaking from dozens of wounds. Lisa Chen led a team to plant explosives at the base of the hive structure. They worked quickly, placing charges at key structural points. The swarm seemed to sense what they were doing and threw everything they had at the demolition team. Lisa's armor was scored with acid burns and claw marks by the time she finished, but the charges were set. Jake ordered everyone to fall back. The Marines retreated in good order, still firing, still fighting. When they were clear, Lisa triggered the explosives. The charges detonated simultaneously and the massive hive structure shuddered. For a moment it seemed like it might hold. Then cracks appeared in the organic walls, spreading rapidly. The structure began to collapse in on itself with a sound like tearing flesh. The destruction of the hive sent shockwaves through the local swarm organisms. Without the coordinating presence of the hive mind, they became disorganized and easier to kill. The Marines pressed their advantage, hunting down the remaining creatures systematically. By nightfall, the capital city was secure. The swarm had been driven out or destroyed. Human and Valari forces began the grim work of clearing bodies and extinguishing fires. Medical teams treated the wounded, both human and alien. Engineers assessed the damage to the city's infrastructure. Jake stood on. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace like thunder rolling across a silent sky. 5 massive dreadnoughts appeared in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with weapon ports and armor plating. For a moment, everything in the Valari system seemed to pause. The swarm bioships stopped their relentless assault. The remaining Valari vessels held their fire. It was as if the universe itself took a breath. Admiral Patricia Cole stood on the bridge of the Defiance watching the tactical display. The swarm ships outnumbered them at least 50-1. The odds were terrible, but Patricia had never been the kind of commander who let numbers decide battles. She had trained for this her entire career. Now it was time to see if humanity's weapons and tactics could match an enemy that had conquered multiple worlds. The swarm bioships were like nothing human eyes had ever seen. They were organic, living vessels that ranged from the size of a fighter jet to massive creatures larger than buildings. Their hulls were dark chitin layered over pulsing flesh. Some had tentacles that writhed in the vacuum of space. Others had wing-like appendages covered in what looked like eyes. They moved with an insect grace that was both beautiful and horrifying. Patricia opened a wideband communication channel, broadcasting on every frequency. She spoke clearly and slowly, knowing the Velari would be listening and hoping their translators were good enough to understand. She identified herself as Admiral Patricia Cole of the Human United Defense Command. She told them that humanity had received their distress call and had come to help. She asked them to identify their command vessel. For a long moment there was only static. Then a voice responded, melodious and filled with disbelief. The speaker identified himself as Commander Thelvar of the Velari Defense Fleet, currently aboard the Lightbringer. He said he could not believe what he was seeing. They had sent their call into the void 2 months ago, never truly believing anyone would answer. Now these strange new ships had appeared, and Thelvar did not know whether to feel hope or fear. Patricia told him to feel hope. Humanity had brought 5 of its most powerful warships and was prepared to engage the swarm immediately. She asked for tactical information about the enemy and the current situation on the ground. Thelvar's report was grim. The swarm had been attacking for 6 days. The Velari orbital platforms were destroyed. Their fleet was reduced to 7 ships from an original 40. Ground forces were retreating on all continents. The capital city was hours away from being overrun. The Velari had fought bravely, but their weapons simply could not damage the swarm bioships effectively. Their energy beams scorched the organic hulls, but did not penetrate deep enough to kill the vessels. Patricia thanked him for the information and told him to pull his remaining ships back behind the human fleet. It was time for humanity to show the swarm what real firepower looked like. The Defiance moved forward, leading the formation toward the densest concentration of enemy ships. The other dreadnoughts spread out, creating a wall of steel between the swarm and the planet below. On every ship, weapon systems powered up with a sound like distant thunder. Railguns extended from their housings. Missile tubes opened. Point defense turrets swiveled, tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously. The swarm seemed to recognize the challenge. The bioships turned away from the planet and began moving toward the human fleet. They came in a wave like a living tide of teeth and claws and hunger. There were so many that they blotted out the stars behind them. Patricia waited until they were in optimal range. Then she gave the order that would start humanity's first interstellar war. She said one word into the fleet-wide channel: fire. The universe exploded with light and sound. The Defiance's main railguns fired simultaneously, sending 12 tungsten slugs screaming toward the enemy, at a significant fraction of light speed. The projectiles crossed the distance in seconds and slammed into the leading swarm bioships with devastating force. The effect was immediate and brutal. The first bioship hit by a railgun slug simply exploded, its organic structure unable to withstand the kinetic energy transfer. Chunks of chitin and flesh sprayed in all directions. The second ship was cut in half, its 2 pieces tumbling away in different directions. The third, fourth, and fifth ships met similar fates. In the span of 3 seconds, the Defiance had destroyed 12 swarm vessels. The other 4 dreadnoughts fired their own railguns, and dozens more bioships died in explosions of gore and armor fragments. Lieutenant Sophie Grant watched her screens with fierce satisfaction. The targeting solutions were perfect. The railguns were performing exactly as designed. She coordinated the next volley, already identifying the largest and most dangerous-looking bioships for priority targeting. Her fingers flew across her console as she directed the weapon systems with the precision of a surgeon. The swarm reacted with frightening speed. The bioships scattered, breaking their tight formation and attacking from multiple angles. They were faster than any human ship their size. They darted and weaved, making themselves harder to target. Some of them began launching smaller organisms, living missiles that shot toward the human fleet with the speed of bullets. The point defense systems engaged automatically. Thousands of small-caliber guns tracked and fired, filling space with a web of tracers. The living missiles exploded as the defensive fire tore them apart, but there were so many that some got through. They slammed into the Dreadnoughts' hulls, exploding on impact or trying to burrow through the armor. Damage reports started coming in from across the fleet. The Valiant had taken hits to its port side. The Thunderbolt reported minor hull breaches on decks 7 and 8. The Frontier had lost a point defense turret to a particularly large organism that had crashed into it like a meteor. But the human ships held. Their armor was thick, layered titanium and ceramic designed to withstand the worst weapons humanity could imagine. The swarm's biological weapons were terrifying, but they were not enough to penetrate meters of military-grade plating. Patricia ordered the fleet to advance. The Dreadnoughts moved forward, firing continuously. The railguns cycled every 6 seconds, each shot claiming at least one swarm bioship. The missile batteries launched fusion-tipped warheads that streaked toward the larger enemy vessels and detonated with miniature suns of destruction. The battle became a grinding exchange of fire. The swarm threw everything they had at the human fleet, wave after wave of bioships and living weapons. But for every hit they scored, the humans killed dozens of them. The mathematics of the engagement were brutal and simple. The swarm could not sustain losses at this rate. Commander Thelvar watched from the Lightbringer, his alien eyes wide with amazement. The Valari had fought the swarm for months and barely scratched them. These humans had arrived and were cutting through the enemy like they were nothing. The newcomers' weapons were primitive in some ways, just hurling metal at high speeds, but the raw kinetic force was devastating. And the humans seemed to have an endless supply of ammunition. One of the larger swarm hive ships, a massive organism easily 3 times the size of a dreadnought, began moving toward the Defiance. It was a command vessel, Thelvar knew, containing one of the swarm's submines. If that ship reached the flagship, it could release thousands of boarding organisms. Patricia saw it coming. She ordered the Defiance to hold position and told Chief Engineer Danny Price to prepare the experimental weapon. Danny hesitated for only a second before confirming. He had hoped they would not need to use the plasma lance this early in the battle, but the hive ship was too dangerous to ignore. Deep in the Defiance's engineering section, Danny and his team began the activation sequence. The plasma lance required diverting all power from the main reactor directly into a focusing array. For the 30 seconds it took to charge and fire, the ship would be vulnerable, its shields and weapons offline. But the lance itself was powerful enough to cut a moon in half. The reactor's output increased to maximum. Power flowed through conduits that glowed white-hot from the energy surge. The focusing array at the front of the ship began to glow, building from red to orange to yellow to a blinding white. Danny watched the readings carefully, his hand hovering over the emergency shutdown. If the containment failed, the Defiance would be vaporized. The charge reached critical levels. Patricia gave the command to fire. A beam of pure plasma erupted from the Defiance's bow. It was like a sword made of sunlight, impossibly bright and impossibly hot. The lance crossed the distance to the hive ship in an instant and struck it dead center. The effect was catastrophic. The plasma beam punched through the organic hull, boiling flesh and vaporizing chitin. It continued through the entire length of the massive vessel and out the other side. For a moment, the hive ship seemed intact. Then it began to split apart along the line the lance had cut. The two halves separated, spilling atmosphere and smaller organisms into the void. The ship died, and with it, a piece of the swarm's collective mind. The psychic backlash of the hive ship's death rippled through the swarm fleet. Every bioship within 1,000 kilometers recoiled as if struck. The coordinated attack faltered. Individual bioships began moving erratically, their connection to the larger hive mind temporarily disrupted. Patricia saw the opening and seized it. She ordered all ships to focus fire. The journey through hyperspace was nothing like the movies made it seem. There were no streaking stars or colorful tunnels of light. The view from the Defiance's window showed only a flat, gray emptiness that hurt to look at for too long. It was a space between spaces, a shortcut through reality that human scientists barely understood. The trip to Valari space would take 3 weeks, and every member of the crew knew those weeks might be their last chance to prepare. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the Marine training bay, watching his soldiers run combat drills. Jake was a broad-shouldered man with a scarred face and the kind of calm confidence that came from surviving dozens of battles. He had fought pirates in the asteroid belt, put down a rebellion on Europa, and cleared hostile environments on 6 different planets. But he had never fought aliens before. None of them had. The Marines practiced room-clearing techniques, moving through mock corridors in full combat armor. Their weapons were loaded with training rounds, but the intensity was real. Jake walked among them, correcting stances and calling out mistakes. These men and women would be the first humans to face the swarm up close, and Jake intended to make sure they were ready. His second-in-command, Sergeant Lisa Chen, approached with a data pad. Lisa was small and quick, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had grown up in the military, following in her father's footsteps, and she was one of the best tactical minds Jake had ever worked with. She showed him the latest intelligence report on the swarm. The information was limited. The Valari descriptions spoke of living ships that moved like insects, coordinated through some kind of hive mind. They could adapt quickly to new threats and seemed to feel no fear. Individual swarm organisms ranged from the size of a dog to larger than a tank. They had claws, acid, and armored carapaces. Some could fly. Others burrowed underground. Jake studied the images the Valari had transmitted. The swarm looked like nightmares made real, all teeth and chitin and hungry eyes. He had fought in zero gravity, in toxic atmospheres, and in cave systems where the walls tried to kill you. But this was different. This was an enemy that existed only to consume. He gathered his Marines for a briefing. 300 faces looked back at him, some young and nervous, others veteran and grim. Jake told them the truth. The swarm was unlike anything humanity had encountered. They would be fighting in close quarters against an enemy that outnumbered them and had biological weapons humans could barely imagine. Some of them would not come home. But, Jake continued, Marines did not run from hard fights. They ran toward them. The Valari needed help, and humanity had decided to provide it. That meant these Marines would do their job no matter how ugly it got. They would hold the line. They would protect the innocent. They would show the galaxy what humans were made of. The Marines responded with a thunderous battle cry that echoed through the training bay. Jake felt a surge of pride. These were good soldiers. They would do what needed to be done. Elsewhere on the Defiance, Lieutenant Sophie Grant worked in the Weapons Control Center. Sophie was young for her rank, only 28, but she had graduated top of her class at the Naval Academy and had proven herself in every simulation. She was responsible for coordinating the Defiance's primary armament, a complex task that required managing dozens of systems simultaneously. The ship's main weapons were railguns, electromagnetic cannons that accelerated metal slugs to incredible speeds. At full power, a railgun could punch through 50 meters of solid steel. The Defiance mounted 12 of them, arranged in clusters that could fire in any direction. Sophie had spent the last week running simulations, testing firing patterns, and calculating optimal targeting solutions. Her team worked around the clock, fine-tuning the systems. The railguns had to be perfectly calibrated. A misalignment of even a fraction of a degree could mean the difference between a hit and a miss at long range. Sophie checked and rechecked every calculation, her eyes burning from staring at screens for too many hours. Chief Engineer Danny Price visited the weapons bay to check on their progress. Danny was a massive man with hands like wrenches and a mind that understood machines better than people. He had built half the systems on the Defiance himself and could fix anything that broke. He looked over Sophie's shoulder at her calculations and nodded with approval. Danny had his own concerns. The Defiance's reactor was experimental, a new fusion design that generated more power than any previous human ship. That power was necessary to run all the weapons and shields simultaneously, but it also meant the reactor was untested in real combat conditions. Danny had run every diagnostic possible, but he knew that theory and practice were often very different things. He spent his days in the engineering section, surrounded by the massive reactor core that pulsed with barely contained energy. His team monitored every fluctuation, every temperature change, every microscopic variation in the containment field. The reactor was stable, but Danny was not the kind of man who trusted stability. He prepared backup systems, redundant cooling lines, and emergency shutdown procedures. If something went wrong, he would be ready. Admiral Patricia Cole rarely slept during the journey. She spent her nights on the bridge, reviewing intelligence reports and planning strategy. The Valari had provided what information they could, but it was incomplete. Patricia did not know how many swarm ships she would face or what their capabilities were. She was flying into a battle with too many unknowns. Her command staff met with her every day to discuss options. They war-gamed different scenarios, from ambushes to fleet engagements to planetary assaults. Patricia listened to every suggestion, considered every possibility. She was known for her aggressive tactics, but she was also known for bringing her people home. This mission would require both qualities. The other 4 dreadnoughts in the fleet maintained constant communication with the Defiance. The Valiant, commanded by Captain Richard Stone, took position on the right flank. The Thunderbolt, under Captain Nicole Freeman, held the left. The Retribution and the Frontier followed behind, ready to support wherever needed. Each ship carried a full complement of Marines, fighter craft, and enough ammunition to level a city. As the fleet drew closer to Valari space, tension increased throughout the ships. Crew members wrote letters home just in case. Chaplains held services for those who wanted them. In the quiet moments, people thought about what they were flying toward and whether they would survive it. On the 15th day of the journey, the Defiance received a new transmission from the Valari. It was another distress call, more desperate than the first. The swarm had reached their homeworld. Orbital defenses were falling. Cities were being overrun. The Valari fleet was down to a handful of ships. They begged for anyone listening to hurry. Patricia increased speed, pushing the reactors to their limits. The fleet would arrive in 4 days. She only hoped that would be fast enough. Jake intensified training. The Marines now drilled 20 hours a day, stopping only to eat and sleep. They practiced fighting in teams, covering each other, moving through hostile territory. They learned to recognize swarm organisms from the Valari descriptions and how to kill each type most efficiently. Fire worked well. Explosives were better. Headshots were essential. Sophie completed her weapon calibrations and began studying swarm ship movements from the limited footage the Valari had provided. The bioships moved erratically, but not randomly. There was a pattern, a kind of terrible intelligence behind their attacks. She programmed targeting algorithms that would predict their movements and compensate for their speed. Danny reinforced every critical system on the Defiance. He installed backup power lines, redundant computer cores, and emergency bulkheads that could seal off damaged sections. He prepared his engineering teams for the worst, drilling them on damage control procedures until they could work in their sleep. On the 19th day, the fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Valari system. The gray void disappeared, replaced by the familiar starlight of normal space. Sensors immediately began gathering data, painting a picture of what lay ahead. What they saw made even the most veteran officers pause. The Valari homeworld was surrounded by hundreds of swarm bioships, dark organic shapes that pulsed with sickly green light. The orbital space was thick with debris and bodies. A few Valari vessels still fought, their elegant crystalline hulls glowing as they fired energy weapons that barely seemed to hurt the enemy. Patricia stood on the bridge, her face carved from stone as she watched the battle unfold on the main screen. This was worse than the intelligence reports had suggested. The swarm was not just attacking. They were overwhelming. It was like watching locusts devour a field. She opened a channel to the entire fleet. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with absolute certainty. They had come to help the Valari. They had come to fight the swarm, and they would show these monsters what happened when they threatened innocent lives. Patricia gave the order. The 5 human dreadnoughts accelerated toward the battlefield, their weapons powering up, their crews ready for war. The swarm had never faced humanity before. That was about to change. Claire Martinez sat at her console aboard Sentinel-7, watching the endless stream of cosmic noise flow across her screens. She had been monitoring deep space communications for 3 years now, and most days were exactly the same. Random pulses from distant stars, background radiation, and the occasional automated beacon from human exploration probes. Nothing exciting ever happened out here on the edge of known space. Tonight felt different somehow. Claire rubbed her tired eyes and took another sip of cold coffee. The night shift was always the hardest when the rest of the crew slept and she was alone with the silence of space. She was about to run another routine diagnostic when something caught her attention. A signal, faint but unmistakably artificial, appeared on her secondary monitor. Her heart began to race. Claire leaned forward, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she isolated the signal and boosted its strength. The pattern was unlike anything in the human database. It repeated every 30 seconds, growing slightly weaker with each cycle. Someone was broadcasting this and they were far away. Claire hit the emergency alert button. Within minutes, Captain Henry Blake rushed onto the bridge, still pulling on his uniform jacket. He was a tall man with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades in space. He looked at Claire's screen and immediately understood the significance. The signal was a distress call. Even without translation, the desperate rhythm of the transmission was clear. Claire played the audio feed and a strange musical voice filled the bridge. The words were alien, but the emotion behind them was universal. Fear, desperation, a plea for help. Captain Blake ordered the entire linguistics team awakened. Within an hour, Sentinel-7 buzzed with activity as scientists and translators worked to decode the message. The station's quantum computer analyzed the signal structure, comparing it against theoretical linguistic models. Slowly, painfully, the meaning began to emerge. The aliens called themselves the Valari. Their worlds were under attack by something they called the Swarm. 3 colonies had already fallen. Their homeworld was next. They sent this message into the void, hoping that anyone might hear and come to their aid. The transmission had been traveling through space for 2 months. Captain Blake immediately transmitted everything to Earth. The message would take hours to arrive, but this was too important to delay. He sat in his command chair listening to the Valari distress call play over and over. The fear in those alien voices haunted him. These were people who knew they were about to die. Back on Earth, deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Admiral Patricia Cole received the transmission in her office at United Defense Command headquarters. She was a legend in the human military, a woman who had led the defense of Mars colony during the mining wars, and later commanded the first missions beyond the solar system. She had seen combat that would break most soldiers, but she had never heard anything quite like this. Patricia played the message 3 times, listening carefully to every word the translators had managed to decode. The Valari described the swarm as an endless tide of living ships that consumed everything in their path. They ate planets, absorbed populations, and left nothing but dead rocks behind. The Valari had fought for months, but they were losing. Their weapons barely scratched the enemy. Their fleets were shattered. Their hope was gone. Patricia called an emergency meeting of the Defense Council. 20 minutes later, she stood before a room full of generals, admirals, and politicians, all of them looking at her with tired, worried faces. She played them the message and watched their reactions. Some looked skeptical. Others looked afraid. A few looked angry. General Martin Hayes spoke first. He was an older man, cautious by nature, and he voiced what many were thinking. Humanity had only just reached the stars. They had explored maybe a dozen systems. They had never encountered another intelligent species before. Now they were being asked to fly into unknown space and fight an enemy they knew nothing about. It was too risky. Senator Linda Cooper agreed. Humanity's fleet was small. Every ship was precious. They couldn't risk their dreadnoughts on a mission that might be a trap or a lost cause. Earth's security came first. Patricia let them talk. She stood at the head of the table, her arms crossed, waiting for the right moment. When the room finally quieted, she spoke in a clear, firm voice that commanded attention. She reminded them that humanity had always defined itself by its choices. When faced with injustice or suffering, humans had always chosen to act. It was what made them different from the cold mathematics of survival. It was what made them human. The Valari were dying and they had asked for help. How could humanity call itself civilized if it turned away? More importantly, Patricia argued, the threat was real. If the swarm had already destroyed 3 alien worlds and was about to take a 4th, what would stop them from continuing? Space was vast but not infinite. Eventually, the swarm would find Earth. Better to fight them now on humanity's terms than wait for them to arrive at the doorstep. The debate lasted 4 hours. Arguments flew back and forth across the table. Some wanted to send a small scout force. Others wanted to wait and gather more intelligence. But Patricia held firm. If humanity was going to respond, it needed to respond with strength. A half measure would accomplish nothing. Finally, the vote was called. By a narrow margin, the council agreed. Humanity would answer the Valari distress call. They would send a fleet. Patricia was given command of the 1st Expeditionary Fleet. It would consist of 5 Dreadnought-class warships, the most powerful vessels humanity had ever built. Each dreadnought was nearly 2 kilometers long, armored with layered titanium ceramic plating, and armed with railguns capable of firing projectiles at tremendous speeds. They carried fusion missiles, laser batteries, and point defense systems that could track 1,000 targets simultaneously. The flagship would be the Defiance, Patricia's own command. Within hours, orders went out across Earth and its colonies. Crews were assembled. Marines were briefed. Engineers began loading supplies and ammunition. The shipyards orbiting Luna worked around the clock to prepare the vessels for immediate departure. Patricia stood in the observation deck of the Defiance, watching Earth slowly rotate beneath her. Somewhere down there, her daughter was probably asleep, unaware that her mother was about to lead humanity's first military mission to another species' homeworld. Patricia had not told her family where she was going or how dangerous it might be. There was no point in worrying them. She thought about the Valari, alone in the darkness, waiting for a rescue that they probably believed would never come. She thought about the swarm, whatever they were, consuming worlds without mercy or hesitation. And she thought about humanity, taking its first real steps into a galaxy that was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The Defiance's engines hummed to life. The other 4 dreadnoughts moved into formation around the flagship. Patricia gave the order, and the fleet accelerated away from Earth, heading toward the hyperspace jump point that would carry them across the stars. Humanity had heard the call for help. Now it was time to answer.